Alright, let's go. Number 10. Bluefish Caves and the Bones That Broke the Timeline. In the late 1970s, a Canadian archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars began excavating three small limestone cavities on a ridge in the northern Yukon, roughly 50 kilometers southwest of the village of Old Crow. The caves were unremarkable to look at. Shallow, cramped, barely deep enough to shelter a person from wind. What they held was a sediment layer packed with the bones of animals that no longer exist on this continent. Frozen and unfrozen across tens of thousands of years in a region that never glaciated. Mammoth, horse, bison, caribou, wolf, lion. An entire vanished fauna compressed into a few meters of frigid dirt. This ridge sits inside what geologists call Beringia, the vast unglaciated corridor that once joined Siberia to Alaska when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. During the last glacial maximum, it was not a bridge in any meaningful sense. It was a subcontinent, cold, dry, grassy, and enormous. And Bluefish Caves is one of the only places in that entire drowned landmass where the record survived, where humans could reach it. Cinq-Mars examined the bone fragments and found something on them. Marks. Straight, deliberate cuts on the surface of the fossils. The kind of incisions left when a stone edge is drawn repeatedly across a joint to separate meat from bone. He radiocarbon dated the associated material, and the numbers came back at figures that no one in North American archaeology was prepared to accept. He published anyway. The response was decades of dismissal. Rodent gnawing, colleagues suggested. Trampling. Carnivore teeth. Sediment abrasion. Anything but a human hand. In 2017, Lauriane Bourgeon and a team at the University of Montreal re-examined the collection. 36,000 bone fragments, analyzed one at a time under high magnification, each mark compared against experimental references for tooth damage, trampling, and butchery. 15 specimens carried marks that could only have been made by stone tools. The oldest of them, a horse mandible, dated to approximately 24,000 years ago. But here's where the conventional model of American prehistory falls apart. For most of the 20th century, the accepted arrival date for humans in the Americas was roughly 13,000 years ago, tied to the Clovis culture and the opening of an ice-free corridor between the retreating continental glaciers. That corridor did not exist 24,000 years ago. The ice sheets were at their maximum. Anyone standing in those caves cutting meat off a horse's jaw was in Beringia at the coldest, harshest moment of the last ice age, with the entire southern continent sealed behind kilometers of ice, and they stayed there, not passing through, not migrating, occupying. The implications are staggering. If the Bluefish dates hold, human beings were present in the Americas for 11,000 years before the culture we once believed was first. 11,000 years is longer than the entire span from the founding of the earliest cities to the present day. An interval that length, occupied by people, and what remains of it is 15 scratched bones in a museum drawer. We do not know what they built. We do not know what they believed. We do not know how many of them there were, or whether their descendants survived at all, or whether their line vanished into the ice without ever reaching the continent below. Their tools have not been found. Their dwellings have not been found. Their dead have not been found. All that persists of them is the trace of a blade on a horse's jawbone, preserved by permafrost in a cave the size of a small room. And they were not alone in those caves. The animals whose bones they cut were being hunted by something else as well. Number 9. The short-faced bear. Every cave in the American West that has ever yielded Pleistocene bone has yielded the same recurring visitor. Not as a resident. Not as a scavenger picking through an older assemblage. As a skeleton settled into the sediment among the remains of horses and camels and bison, belonging to an animal called Arctodus simus, one of the largest carnivorous land mammals that ever lived. The bones have come out of sinkholes, fissure caves, and collapsed limestone chambers scattered across the interior of the continent. They arrive in pieces, usually a femur, a section of pelvis, and occasionally something far more difficult to look at, an enormous skull with a distinctive short, broad snout, the muzzle compressed forward into a face that reads less like a bear and more like a cat, scaled to impossible dimensions. The measurements are what force the recalibration. Standing on its hind legs, Arctodus simus rose over 11 feet, towering over any modern grizzly. Its head, at full extension, would have cleared the roofline of a single-story house. A large grizzly represents the upper limit of what most people can imagine a bear being. Arctodus was substantially beyond that limit. When paleontologists reconstruct it beside a human skeleton for scale, the human figure looks like a mistake in the diagram. But the size is not the disturbing part. The legs are. Bears are built for endurance and leverage, not speed. Their limbs are short, heavy, and angled for digging and grappling. Arctodus was assembled differently. Its legs were long and comparatively slender, the proportions of an animal designed to cover open ground, and that architecture suggests something that changes the entire character of the Pleistocene landscape. This bear may have been able to run down prey across open terrain, not ambush it from cover, not corner it in a ravine, pursue it in the open, at distance, across the same grasslands that supported horse and bison herds in numbers no living ecosystem can match. The alternative interpretation is not more comforting. Some researchers argue Arctodus was less a hunter than a bully scavenger, using its size and reach to muscle other predators off their kills. Consider what that requires. To make a living by theft, an animal must be capable of walking into a scene where American lions or dire wolves have already brought down a bison, and simply taking it, not fighting for it, taking it. That is not a survival strategy available to anything that can be challenged. What makes the short-faced bear particularly unsettling is the geography. These bones are not confined to one basin or one range. They appear in cave after cave, from the northern Rockies down through the Great Basin and into the southwest, which means the animal was not rare and not localized. It was distributed across the entire western half of the continent, in the same corridors, the same valleys, and the same limestone country where the earliest people in the Americas were leaving their cut marks on mammoth bone. They shared the landscape. That is the fact that lingers. Every ancestral hunting party moving through the interior of North America did so inside the range of an 11-foot carnivore that could outrun them and did not need to hide. And the caves themselves offer no refuge in that arrangement. A dark chamber in a limestone hillside is not shelter when the thing that occupies it in the winter is the largest predator on the continent, which raises the question of what would drive human beings underground anyway. Not for a night, not for a season. Miles underground, into total darkness, carrying nothing but fire. Number 8. Mammoth Cave's dead. Beneath the limestone hills of central Kentucky lies the longest cave system on Earth. Over 400 mapped miles of passage, chamber, and crawlway, and surveyors continue to add more every year. There is no known end to it. The system is so vast that the total extent remains genuinely unknown, a labyrinth of interconnected voids running for hundreds of miles beneath farmland and forest in total, absolute darkness. Roughly 4,000 years ago, people began walking into it. Not to the entrance, not to the twilight zone where daylight still reaches and shelter is practical. Miles in, prehistoric miners from the late Archaic and early woodland periods penetrated deep into the interior of Mammoth Cave to gather minerals, gypsum crystals scraped from the walls and ceilings, mirabilite, epsomite, selenite. They carried torches made from bundled river cane and reeds. They wore woven sandals. they left the burned stubs of those torches scattered along passages that would not see another human being for 2,000 years. The cave preserved everything. Mammoth Cave's interior maintains stable temperature and low humidity in its upper levels, conditions that halt decay almost entirely. Fragments of cane torch still lie where they were dropped. Woven fiber sandals sit on the cave floor with the weave intact. Gourd fragments, cordage, wooden bowls, the discarded tools of an industry that operated by firelight underground for over a millennium. And then there are the bodies. Naturally desiccated human remains have been recovered from the Mammoth Cave system, dried by the cave air into something closer to leather than to bone. Skin, hair, recognizable features. Human beings who walked into the dark and never walked back out, preserved by the same conditions that preserved their sandals. The most well-documented of them is the man called Lost John, discovered in 1935, a prehistoric miner who died approximately 2,000 years ago. He had been working beneath a limestone boulder, undercutting it to extract the mineral deposits underneath. The boulder shifted. It came down on him and pinned him against the cave floor, and he died there in the position it left him, miles from the entrance, in absolute darkness. His body was found still trapped beneath the rock that killed him. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. Lost John was not alone in the cave when he died. Mining operations of this kind required groups. Whoever was working alongside him would have heard it happen, and then would have stood in the flickering light of reed torches, in a passage miles from the surface, understanding that the boulder could not be moved, and that the torches would not last forever. They left him. They walked back out through the dark. And the record they left behind, the torch fragments and the scraped walls, shows that people kept coming back to those same passages for generations afterward. Consider what that required. No maps, no metal, no light source beyond a bundle of dried cane that burns for perhaps an hour before it must be replaced. Every trip into Mammoth Cave was a calculation about how much fire a person could carry against how far they intended to travel, with no margin for a wrong turn in a system that branches into hundreds of miles of identical stone corridors. They did this repeatedly for economic reasons, to collect crystals from the walls of the underworld. They mapped that darkness with nothing but memory. The mining stopped around 2,000 years ago. The reason has never been established. The passages were simply abandoned, and the torch stubs lay undisturbed on the floor until the 19th century, when saltpeter miners and tourists began finding artifacts and bodies in the deep chambers, and had no framework for understanding who had put them there. They were not the only ones who moved through American caves by firelight. And in the passages of Tennessee, the evidence shows something was moving through the dark alongside them. Number 7. The Jaguar tracks. Deep inside a cave system in Tennessee, far beyond the reach of daylight, beyond the zone where any surface weather penetrates, there is a stretch of soft clay floor that has not been disturbed in thousands of years. Pressed into that clay are the paw prints of a jaguar, not a smear, not an ambiguous depression that might be interpreted as an animal track. Complete impressions. Pad, toes, the deliberate weight distribution of a large cat moving through darkness with total confidence. The prints survived because nothing happened to them. That is the entire mechanism of their preservation. In the deep zone of a cave system, there is no wind, no rain, no freeze-thaw cycle, no burrowing animals, no root intrusion. Temperature holds within a degree or two across centuries. The clay that recorded the animal's passage simply sat there, undisturbed, while the world above cycled through ice ages, extinctions, and the entire span of recorded human history. What was left behind in a single afternoon of animal movement became a fossil in place, without ever being buried, and the jaguar was not alone down there. Alongside the tracks, on the walls and ceilings of these passages, investigators found the black smudge marks left by burning torches. Ancient people carried fire into the same darkness. They walked the same passages, over the same clay, in the same absolute blackness that the cat had navigated by whisker and scent. The torch marks and the paw prints occupy the same underground geography. But here's where the discovery reshapes something larger than a single cave. The modern range of the jaguar begins thousands of kilometers to the south. Central America, the Amazon basin, a thin, fragile remnant population that occasionally crosses into the Arizona borderlands and makes national news when a trail camera catches one. That is the animal as it exists today. A tropical predator pushed south, confined to shrinking forest. The tracks in Tennessee describe a different continent entirely. Jaguars ranged across the eastern United States. Not as strays, not as isolated wanderers. As a resident predator moving through cave systems in the Appalachian interior with enough regularity that the geological record caught one in the act. What makes this particular find so unsettling is not the cat. It is the proximity. The eastern woodlands that would later be mapped, farmed, logged, and paved were once a predator landscape. The people who carried reed torches into those caves shared their world with an ambush hunter capable of crushing a skull with a single bite, an animal that hunts by preference in low light, in dense cover, at close range. They went underground anyway. Consider what that required. Total darkness. A burning bundle of reeds that might last an hour. Passages that narrow and turn and offer no orientation. And somewhere in that system, possibly recently, possibly at that exact moment, something with paws the width of a human hand had walked the same floor. There is no way to know whether the two ever met. The Clay Records movement, not outcome. It preserves the fact of a jaguar walking through a Tennessee cave and the fact of humans walking through the same one, and it declines to say anything further. The tracks remain there now, in the cold and the dark, exactly as they were pressed. An animal that no longer exists in that part of the world left a record of itself in a place where nothing ever comes to erase it. And the jaguar was not the most formidable predator sharing that landscape. Number 6. Smilodon in the dark. The tracks in Tennessee prove a predator walked those passages. The caves of the American West preserved what that kind of predator actually was, and in some cases, they preserved it almost whole. At Cathedral Cave in the Great Basin, in fissure deposits scattered across the western states, and in the asphalt seeps of Rancho La Brea in what is now central Los Angeles, excavators have pulled out the remains of Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, in numbers that no other extinct American predator can match. Not fragments, not a scattering of teeth, complete skeletons, stacked in the sediment, one on top of another. The animal they reconstruct is difficult to look at without a physical reaction. The upper canines reach 7 inches, curved and flattened like blades rather than cones, extending well below the jawline even when the mouth was closed. Those teeth were not built for crushing bone. They were built for a single, precise, catastrophic bite to the throat or the belly of something already immobilized. And the immobilization is written into the rest of the skeleton. The forelimbs are enormously thick, the shoulder attachments massive, the musculature implied by the bone ridges far beyond anything a modern lion carries. This was not an ambush cat that ran its prey down and wrestled it. It was a machine engineered to pin a bison to the ground and hold it perfectly still while the teeth did the work. But here's where the fossils stop being an anatomy lesson and start becoming something closer to a biography. A remarkable number of Smilodon skeletons recovered from these deposits show injuries. Shattered ribs, crushed hip sockets, broken shoulder blades, vertebrae fused by trauma. Pelvic damage so severe the animal could not have hunted for months, and the injuries are healed. The bone had regrown around the damage. The fractures had knitted. These cats sustained wounds that would have ended a solitary predator within days, and then they lived long enough for the skeleton to repair itself and for the repair to fossilize. Something kept them alive while they could not hunt. Something brought them food or tolerated their presence at a kill they had contributed nothing to. The conclusion drawn from this pattern is that Smilodon may not have hunted alone. Unlike almost every large cat alive today, the evidence points toward social structure, toward groups, toward animals that fed injured members long enough for those members to recover. Prides in the dark. What makes this particularly unsettling is how it changes the encounter. A solitary saber-tooth is a hazard, an obstacle, a thing to be avoided by paying attention to the ground and the wind. A cooperative group of them is a strategy. It is coordination. It means that the humans moving through these landscapes 12 or 15,000 years ago were not competing with an animal. They were competing with an organization, one that outweighed them, outnumbered them, and had been perfecting its methods for hundreds of thousands of years before the first person ever walked into North America. The caves preserved them because caves preserve everything that falls in and never comes out. Smilodon fell in too. The apex predator of the Pleistocene Americas ended up in the same sediment layers as the horses and the camels it hunted, its 7-inch canines still intact, its healed ribs still recording the day something enormous kicked it, and it survived. The bones are cataloged now, drawer after drawer of them, in collections from Los Angeles to the Great Basin. The animal is gone. The stories about what lived in those caves are not, and some of them survived in a very different form. Number 5. Lovelock Cave and the legend that refused to die. In 1911, miners working a dry cave on the edge of the ancient Lahontan lake bed in western Nevada began stripping out bat guano to sell as fertilizer. The deposit was meters deep, accumulated over thousands of years in the still air of a chamber the desert had sealed and forgotten. As the miners dug, artifacts began coming out of the muck. Not a handful. Thousands. Baskets, sandals woven from tool fiber, netting, tools, and duck decoys made from reeds and feathers so precisely constructed that modern hunters could use them without modification. And human remains. The archaeological value was extraordinary. Guano is chemically hostile to decay. The same properties that made it valuable as fertilizer made it a preservation medium, sealing organic material away from moisture and oxygen and holding it in stasis for millennia. Lovelock Cave produced one of the richest inventories of Great Basin material culture ever recovered, an unbroken record of people who lived on the margins of a vanishing lake and knew exactly how to survive there. The decoys alone rewrote assumptions about the sophistication of Great Basin hunting. These were not marginal people scraping at the edge of existence. They were engineers of their environment. But the artifacts are not what made Lovelock Cave famous. The northern Paiute of the region carried a story recorded long before the guano miners arrived. It described the Si-Te-Ka, a hostile people who lived among the Tula marshes and preyed on the Paiute. In the telling, they were red-haired. In the telling, they were cannibals. And in the telling, the conflict ended at a cave, where the Si-Te-Ka were driven into the dark, and the entrance was filled with brush and set alight. The story ends with the enemy sealed inside a mountain and burned out of the world. Then, in 1911, men digging in that cave found human remains in the guano. Some of the bodies appeared unusually tall. Some of the hair was reddish. The interpretation that followed has never fully died. Newspapers reported giants. Popular accounts inflated stature figures with each retelling until the Lovelock dead were said to stand 8, then 10, then 12 feet tall. A century of books, broadcasts, and internet argument has been built on that foundation. The foundation does not hold. Skeletal measurements from Lovelock produce individuals within the normal range of human variation, with some tall specimens and nothing approaching the figures repeated in popular sources. The red hair has an equally deflating explanation. Human hair pigment degrades over long burial, and hair interred in chemically aggressive sediment, particularly guano, oxidizes toward red and orange regardless of its original color. Black hair does not stay black for 2,000 years underground. It rusts. The red-haired giants of Lovelock Cave are ordinary people, altered by chemistry and magnified by retelling. But here is where the mystery becomes genuinely unsettling, and it has nothing to do with giants. Strip away the exaggeration, and something harder remains. The Paiute account describes a cave, a hostile population, and a mass death by fire and entrapment. It was recorded before the excavation, and the excavation found human remains in that cave. The legend does not require giants to be disturbing. It only requires that it be a memory. Oral tradition in the Great Basin has demonstrated remarkable durability, preserving descriptions of landscape features and events across spans that written history in the EE region cannot reach. If the Siteka story encodes an actual conflict, then Lovelock Cave is not a burial site. It is the scene. We cannot confirm it. The 1911 excavation was not archaeology. It was industrial extraction with occasional pauses for curiosity. Context was destroyed as it was created. Stratigraphy that would have told us who was placed in that cave, when, and under what circumstances was shoveled out and sold. Whatever answer the guano held was carried away in sacks and spread across fields. What makes Lovelock Cave particularly haunting is the shape of what survived. The debate that persists is the one built on error. Giants, cannibals, red hair, a lost race. The actual questions, who these people were, and what happened in that chamber, are unanswerable now. Not because the evidence was ambiguous, but because it was thrown away by men who did not know they were standing in a grave. The decoys sit in museum cases, immaculate, patient, made by hands that understood water and birds and time. The bodies were reduced to a rumor, and the cave itself still opens on the old lakeshore, dry and quiet, holding nothing but the story people insist on telling about it. Some caves became tombs because human beings made them tombs. Others required no help at all. Number 4. Natural Trap Cave, the hole in the ground that hunted. In the western foothills of the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, roughly a mile above sea level, there is an opening in the limestone that measures about 15 feet across. It is not marked by a cliff face. It is not set into a hillside where an approaching animal would see it. It sits flush in a gentle slope of grass and sage, invisible until the moment a foot comes down on nothing. Below that opening, the rock widens. The chamber beneath is bell-shaped, flaring outward as it descends, so that the walls curve away from anything falling through the mouth. The floor lies 85 feet down. Nothing that entered ever climbed back out. That is the entire mechanism. There is no ritual here, no burial, no human hand. Natural Trap Cave is a geological accident that functioned as a killing device continuously, without maintenance, without intent, for more than 100,000 years. The floor of the chamber is a mass grave assembled one animal at a time. Excavations in the 1970s pulled tens of thousands of bones from the sediment, and a renewed campaign beginning in 2014, led by paleontologist Julie Meechan of Des Moines University, went deeper still. The species list reads like an inventory of a vanished continent. American lions, larger than any lion alive today, short-faced bears, cheetah-like cats built for open-ground pursuit, mammoths, bison, horses, wolves, camels, all of them stacked in layers that represent tens of thousands of years of accumulated death. The stratigraphy tells the story with a clarity that is almost unbearable. Predators are heavily represented, far more than they would be in an ordinary landscape sample. The reason is not mysterious. A horse breaks through the surface and falls. It survives the impact, or it does not, and either way it makes noise, and it bleeds, and the scent of it rises out of the hole into the open air. The carnivores of Pleistocene North America came to that smell. They came to the edge. Some of them went in after it. The trap baited itself. But here is where the sight becomes genuinely disturbing rather than merely grim. The cave did not stop working. It did not fill in, collapse, or close. Across 100,000 years, entire climatic regimes came and went above that opening. Glaciers advanced across the northern continent and retreated. Grasslands became tundra and became grasslands again. Whole faunas rose to dominance and were annihilated in the end Pleistocene extinction. And through every one of those transformations, the mouth of Natural Trap Cave stayed open, and animals kept walking into it, generation after generation, species after species, with no possibility that any of them could pass on the knowledge of where it was. That is what 100,000 years of continuous operation means. Not a disaster, not an event. A permanent feature of the landscape that consumed a small, steady tribute of the living for a span of time longer than our species has existed in its modern form. The interior explains why the bones survived so well. The chamber is cold and stable, insulated from the seasons above, a natural refrigerator holding near freezing temperatures year-round. Cold air sinks into the bell and stays there. Under those conditions, ancient DNA does not degrade the way it does in open sediment. Genetic material has been recovered from remains many thousands of years old, extracted from animals that vanished from the earth before the first cities were built. The same architecture that killed them preserved them. The trap and the archive are the same object. And so the record sits in that chamber still, 85 feet below a slope of Wyoming grass, layered and legible and effectively complete. Bone by bone, it documents the moment-to-moment reality of an ecosystem that no living human has ever seen, held intact by nothing more sophisticated than cold air and gravity. Preservation on that scale is rare, and it is fragile in ways that are not obvious. A cave that has protected its contents for 100 millennia can lose them in a single season. Somewhere in northwestern Arizona, another chamber held an even stranger and more detailed record of the Pleistocene, one that no excavation could ever have reconstructed from bone alone. Number 3. The Dung Archive. Roughly 6,000 kilometers of the Colorado River corridor cuts through northern Arizona, and set into the limestone walls of the western Grand Canyon is a cave that held one of the strangest and most valuable scientific records ever assembled on the North American continent. Rampart Cave, it contained no monuments, no tombs, no tools. What it contained was excrement, a deposit of preserved Shasta ground sloth dung layered across the cave floor to a depth that took paleontologists years to work through, some of it dating back more than 40,000 years. The Shasta ground sloth was not a small animal. It stood taller than a man when it reared onto its hind legs, moved on curved claws that forced it to walk on the sides of its feet, and browsed the desert vegetation of the late Pleistocene Southwest for tens of thousands of years before disappearing entirely. It left no descendants. It left no written trace, obviously, and almost nothing of its behavior survived in the fossil record, beyond bones and the occasional claw mark. Bones tell you what an animal was. They do not tell you what it ate, what season it ate it in, or how the plants around it shifted as the climate changed across 400 centuries. Rampart Cave told all of it. Generation after generation of sloths returned to the same sheltered chamber. They defecated. They left. The arid conditions inside the cave desiccated the deposits before decay could touch them, and the next generation arrived and did the same thing on top of the last. What accumulated was not a pile of waste. It was a stratified archive, laid down in chronological order, each layer a sealed sample of a single moment in a vanished ecosystem. Researchers extracted intact seeds, leaf fragments, twigs, pollen, and undigested plant fiber from deposits older than the last glacial maximum. From that material, scientists reconstructed the entire diet of an extinct species. Not an estimate, not a model built from toothwear and inference. The actual plants, identifiable to genus, eaten by identifiable animals, on dates that could be measured. The deposits were so well preserved that visitors reported the layers still carried a faint odor. 40,000 years old, and the cave still smelled like the animals that made it. But here's where the story turns from wonder into something considerably harder to sit with. In 1976, fire reached the deposit. Dried organic matter packed into a confined chamber does not burn the way wood burns. It smolders. The fire moved slowly through the layers, consuming the record from the top down and the inside out, and it kept burning for months. Firefighting crews attempted to smother it. Water was carried in. The smoldering continued regardless, working through strata that had survived ice ages, megafaunal extinction, the arrival of humans in the Americas, and the drying of an entire desert. By the time it stopped, most of the archive was gone. What makes the loss of Rampart Cave particularly disturbing is not the fire itself, but what the fire proves about the fragility of the record we depend on. The Shasta ground sloth is extinct. There will be no new deposits. There is no second cave with a matching 40,000-year sequence waiting to be excavated. No backup copy, no possibility of returning to collect. What was missed? Every question that could have been answered by the unsampled layers is now permanently unanswerable. The animals died out roughly 11,000 years ago through processes we still argue about, and the single best physical record of their final millennia burned in the space of a single American summer. The cave is still there. It is gated now, closed, monitored. Inside, beneath a ceiling darkened by soot, sit the charred remnants of a document that took 400 centuries to write and less than a year to destroy. The dry caves preserved by keeping water out. But some of the most extraordinary discoveries in the Americas were made in the opposite condition entirely, in chambers that filled completely and never drained. Number 2. Hoyo Negro's Girl. In 2007, 3 Mexican cave divers pushing through a flooded tunnel system on the Yucatan Peninsula reached the end of a passage and found that the floor had stopped existing. Their lights fell away into nothing. They had swum into the top of an enormous submerged pit, a bell-shaped void roughly 60 meters wide, dropping more than 40 meters into blackness their lamps could not reach. They named it Hoyo Negro, the black hole. At the bottom of that void, scattered across the sediment floor, were bones. Not one skeleton. Dozens of animals, tangled together in a single deposit at the base of the shaft. Gomphotheres, elephant relatives with shovel-shaped lower tusks, extinct for more than 10,000 years. Saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, cave bears. Animals that had walked into a dark chamber in a dry cave system, found the edge in the blackness too late, and fallen. The pit had been collecting them for millennia, a natural oubliette in the limestone that took whatever wandered close enough. And resting among them, nearly complete, was a teenage girl. She was given the name Naya. She was between 15 and 16 years old when she died. Her skeleton is roughly 12,000 to 13,000 years old, which makes her one of the oldest and most complete human beings ever recovered anywhere in the Americas. Her skull was intact. Her teeth were intact. Her pelvis was fractured, consistent with a fall from a considerable height onto stone. The reconstruction of what happened is almost unbearably simple. The Yucatan's cave systems were dry at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels sat more than 100 meters below their current position. The caves held fresh water in pools deep underground, and in an arid landscape, water underground was worth the risk of going down to find it. She went in with a torch, or she went in without one. She reached the lip of a shaft she could not see. Then the floor stopped existing for her, exactly as it did for the divers 11,000 years later. Thousands of years after her death, the ice sheets melted, the sea rose, and the water came up through the limestone and filled the chamber from below. Her body was sealed under 40 meters of groundwater in absolute darkness, untouched, unreachable, and perfectly still. No scavengers, no erosion, no sunlight. The chamber that killed her also preserved her with a completeness that dry ground never could. But here's where the discovery stops being an accident of geology and starts rewriting the origin story of an entire hemisphere. For decades, one of the most persistent problems in American archaeology has been the shape of the earliest skulls. The oldest human remains found in the Americas do not look like modern Native Americans. Their faces are narrower. Their skulls are longer and lower. The differences are consistent enough that a generation of researchers proposed a separate, earlier migration, a first population, physically distinct, later replaced or displaced by the ancestors of the peoples living here when Europeans arrived. It was a theory that quietly detached living indigenous nations from the oldest bones in their own continents. Naya has the ancient skull. Long, narrow, small-faced, exactly the morphology that the replacement theory relied upon, and her DNA links her directly to modern Native Americans. A research team led by James Chatters published the findings in the journal Science in 2014. Mitochondrial DNA extracted from one of her molars carried haplogroup D1, a lineage that arose in Beringia and is carried by indigenous populations across the Americas today. She was not a separate people. She was not an earlier wave, swept aside and forgotten. She was an ancestor. The skull shape was not evidence of a different origin. It was evidence that a single population changed over 12,000 years, in place, on this continent. One girl at the bottom of a flooded pit collapsed a theory that had stood for the better part of a century. What makes Naya particularly haunting is not the science. It is the composition of the scene itself. She lies in a chamber where the only way to reach her is to be a trained technical cave diver, swimming a tunnel in total darkness with no vertical exit, carrying redundant lights and redundant air, working in a space where a mistake is fatal within minutes. She is surrounded by the bones of Gomphotheres and saber-toothed cats that died the same way she did, killed by the same hole in the ground, waiting in the same water. Predator and prey and person, all equal at the bottom, all held in the same silence for 12,000 years. Her skull has been raised and studied. Much of the rest of the deposit remains where it fell, mapped by photogrammetry, visited by a handful of divers, otherwise undisturbed. She is one of the oldest Americans ever found. And she is not the oldest, nor the most intact. In the deserts of the Great Basin, something drier and stranger had been waiting since 1940, a body that never lost its skin. Number 1, the Spirit Cave Mummy. In 1940, archaeologists Sidney and Georgia Wheeler were surveying rock shelters in the Nevada desert east of Fallon, working ahead of federal salvage efforts, when they entered a small dry cave above what had once been the shoreline of an ancient lake. Inside, beneath a shallow layer of dust and rodent debris, they found a burial. The body had been wrapped in woven mats made from tule reeds, the marsh plant that grew in the wetlands below, twisted and plaited with a skill that suggested long practice. On the feet were the remnants of moccasins. The skin had not decomposed. It had dried, hardening across the bone into something with the texture and color of tanned leather. The Wheelers cataloged the find, assigned it an approximate age of around 2,000 years, and sent it to the Nevada State Museum. There it sat in storage for more than 5 decades. In 1994, researchers subjected a small sample of the remains to accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating. The result was not 2,000 years. It was approximately 10,600 years. The man in the reed mats had been buried at the end of the Pleistocene. He was alive while mammoths still walked parts of this continent. He predates the pyramids of Giza by roughly 6,000 years. He predates Stonehenge by more than 5,000. He predates agriculture, writing, the wheel, and every civilization whose name we know. He is among the oldest human mummies ever recovered in North America, and one of the oldest naturally preserved human beings anywhere on Earth. The preservation was an accident of geology. Spirit Cave is desiccated, sheltered, and chemically stable. The air inside does not move. Moisture does not accumulate. Bacteria that would have consumed soft tissue within weeks in any ordinary grave simply could not function. So the skin remained. The hair remained. Fragments of tissue that no burial in a temperate climate could ever have surrendered to us remained, intact across more than 10 millennia, in a hole in the Nevada desert. Nobody thought to look inside until 1940. But here is where the discovery stops being archaeology and becomes something considerably more uncomfortable. The moment the 10,600-year date was published, the remains became contested property. The Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, whose ancestral territory encompasses Spirit Cave, requested the return of the man for reburial under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The Federal Bureau of Land Management, which held legal custody, refused. The stated reasoning was that a cultural affiliation between a 10,600-year-old individual and a living tribe could not be demonstrated. Some researchers argued that the skull's morphology did not match modern Native American populations, and proposed instead that he belonged to an earlier, unrelated migration, a people who came and vanished before the ancestors of today's tribes arrived. The dispute lasted 2 decades. Court filings, appeals. A man dead for 10,000 years, held in a museum drawer, while institutions argued over whether anyone alive had the standing to bury him. The argument was settled by his own genome, ancient DNA extracted from the remains and analyzed by a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, with results later published in Nature in 2018, produced an unambiguous answer. The Spirit Cave man was Native American, not a member of a lost, unrelated population, not an evolutionary dead end. He was directly ancestral to indigenous peoples of the Americas, closely related to the tribes still living within sight of the cave where he was laid down. The skull shape that had been used to sever him from his descendants meant nothing. Morphology had lied. The genome did not. In 2016, the Bureau of Land Management reversed its position and repatriated him to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. He was reburied at a location the tribe has not disclosed. What makes this particular entry the most unsettling on the list is not the age of the body, staggering as that number is. It is what the 2 decades of argument revealed about the assumptions underneath the science. For 20 years, an institutional consensus insisted that this man could not be related to the people who claimed him, and it was wrong. The oldest, best preserved individual ever recovered from an American cave spent longer in litigation than the Wheelers spent excavating him, and the entire dispute existed because we were confident about a relationship we had not actually measured. He is underground again now, somewhere in Nevada, in soil the tribe will not name. The reed mats are gone. The desert that preserved him for 10,000 years has him back. Consider what every entry on this list has in common. Not the animals, not the people, the conditions. Nothing on this list survived because it was important. It survived because it happened to fall, die, or be abandoned in one of the few environments on the continent capable of arresting decay. Permafrost at Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, holding bone fragments and the tool marks scored into them in a frozen matrix that never thawed long enough to matter. Dry desert air at Spirit Cave, wicking moisture out of tissue faster than bacteria could consume it. Cold, stable temperature inside Natural Trap Cave, a natural refrigerator that kept ancient DNA legible across 100,000 years of accumulated death. Anoxic water in the flooded chamber of Hoyo Negro, where the absence of dissolved oxygen meant that a teenage girl's skeleton could rest, undisturbed and articulated, for more than 12,000 years in total darkness. 4 different mechanisms. 4 accidents of geology and chemistry. Without them, none of this exists. The numbers make the point brutally. Natural Trap Cave accumulated remains for over 100,000 years, and it did so because of a single geometric quirk, a hidden mouth in flat ground that no animal could see and no animal could climb out of. Change the shape of that opening by a few meters, and the entire record disappears. Bluefish Caves pushed the human presence in the Americas toward 24,000 years on the evidence of cut marks preserved in frozen bone, not on the evidence of a settlement, not on the evidence of a burial ground, on scratches. In a warmer cave, those scratches would have rotted away with the bone that carried them, and the question of when people arrived here would still be answered the old way. And preservation is not permanent. In 1976, a fire reached the deposits inside Rampart Cave and smoldered for months. What burned was a 40,000-year record of an extinct animal's diet, layer upon layer, laid down season by season by creatures that no longer exist and cannot be observed. That record survived the extinction of the ground sloth itself. It survived the end of the Ice Age, the arrival of humans, the drying of the Southwest, 40 millennia of everything the continent could throw at it. It did not survive the 20th century. What makes this pattern particularly disturbing is what it implies about the volume of the missing. Every cave on this list is an exception. The overwhelming majority of prehistoric America decomposed. The bodies dissolved, the hides rotted, the wooden tools returned to soil, the footprints filled in. The prehistoric miners of Mammoth Cave left torch fragments and woven sandals behind 2 millennia ago, and those objects endured only because they were dropped miles inside a dry limestone system, where nothing grows and nothing decays. The same sandals dropped outside the entrance would have been gone within a generation. So the record we have is not a sample of the past. It is a sample of the places where the past could not be erased. Everything we know about the first Americans, their tools, their diets, their movements, their dead, is filtered through a handful of caves, sinkholes, and flooded chambers that happen to be cold enough, dry enough, or airless enough to hold on. The implications are staggering. Somewhere between the arrival of the first people and the beginning of written history, tens of thousands of years of human experience unfolded across a continent, and almost none of it left anything behind. The caves preserved fragments. They did not preserve the story. What we call prehistoric America is a handful of accidents, recovered by chance, interpreted from the few materials that refuse to rot. And the accidents that have not yet been found are still out there, in the dark, exactly where they fell. They are all still down there. Hoyo Negro has not been emptied. The chamber where Naya came to rest sits beneath the limestone of the Yucatan at the bottom of a flooded shaft, reachable only by divers willing to swim hundreds of meters through submerged passages in total darkness with no direct route to the surface. There is no staircase. There is no visitor center. Every fragment of that chamber, every bone of every animal that fell into the black hole and never climbed out, exists in a place that the human body was not designed to enter and cannot remain in for long. The water is clear. The bones are visible. And the only way to look at them is to become, briefly, the kind of creature that can survive down there. Mammoth Cave runs for more than 400 mapped miles beneath Kentucky, and surveyors continue to add to that number decade after decade. The passages that prehistoric miners walked with reed torches represent a fraction of the system, and the boundaries of where those people actually went have never been fully established. Somewhere in that network are corridors no one has entered since a torch went out 2,000 years ago. Not undiscovered in the sense of being unknown. Undiscovered in the sense that the map simply stops, and the dark continues past the edge of it. Natural Trap Cave is still open. The mouth of that 85-foot shaft remains concealed in the Wyoming ground, invisible until you are standing at its lip, exactly as it was when American lions and short-faced bears and horses walked over it and did not walk away. Researchers have installed a grate. The animals of the Pleistocene had no such courtesy. For more than 100,000 years, the landscape above that hole looked entirely ordinary, and the bell-shaped chamber below filled with the accumulated dead of a continent's vanished fauna. The trap did not malfunction. It worked perfectly for 1,000 centuries on everything that came close enough. Only one of the figures in this account has left the dark for good. In 2016, the man from Spirit Cave, wrapped in tule matting 10,600 years ago and held in a Nevada museum collection for the better part of a century, was returned to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. He had been argued over in courtrooms and laboratories, sampled, cataloged, contested. The genetic evidence ended the dispute. He was who his descendants had always said he was. He was reburied, and the location was not publicized, and that is where the record of him ends. That is the closest thing to resolution in any of this. The rest remains. Sloth dung in Arizona, charred by a fire nobody could put out. Jaguar tracks pressed into Tennessee clay in a chamber that has not been disturbed since the animal made them. Butchered bone in Yukon permafrost that either rewrites the peopling of a hemisphere or does not, depending on which paper you read last. Guano-buried baskets and sandals from Lovelock, tangled forever in a legend that the science does not support and cannot fully dismiss. The caves did not preserve these things for us. They preserved them by accident, through cold and dryness, and darkness and stillness, and they have gone on preserving them for as long as those conditions have held. When the conditions fail, the record goes. There is no backup. There is no second copy of a footprint. Everything we know about the deep American past comes from the few places where the earth happened to hold still. Everything we do not know is in the places where it did not. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.